Good evening, everyone. Very good to see you. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Ryan Musto, and I'm the Director of Forums and Research Initiatives here with GRI. And I think I can admit in this audience, I'm also a historian by training, which is very exciting. And I'm very excited for tonight. So I'm excited for today for a few different reasons. First and foremost, of course, we are excited for the launch of Dr. Brianna Nofil's book, The Migrant Jail, An American History of Mass Incarceration, published by Princeton University Press today. Did it come out today? It came out today, actually today. As Dr. Nofil will describe, this book demonstrates how a century of political, economic, and ideological exchange between the immigration bureaucracy and the criminal justice system gave rise to the US's vast immigration detention system, and how an evolving network of individuals, municipalities, and private corporations profited from jailing. So today is a celebration of that work and the long journey Dr. Nofil took to bring it to fruition. But I am also excited because GRI today gets to experiment with a new type of programmatic offering. Last month, we held a book launch for a GRI research affiliate, Steve Hansen, and it garnered great interest, so much so that Dr. Nofil reached out and said, could we do that again, actually? We realized here at GRI that we should probably make it a programmatic offering. And we're really thankful to be able to have worked with partners to help make that happen. That includes William & Mary Libraries, and that includes Dr. Nofil's home department, the history department. We now have an application for applying for book launches. So if you are a faculty member or researcher with a book that is going to come out soon, please do get in touch with us. We would love to hear about it. So today we're going to celebrate Dr. Nofil's work, and we will probe it after her presentation with a Q&A session. So please be sure to get your questions and comments ready. But at GRI, we also want to use these book launches to help foster collaborations in the future. Our hope here today is that you in the audience will be able to draw on Dr. Nofil's work, but also that you will think through ways that you may be able to collaborate with her, in the future around the themes or topics that she raises. I have to admit, a good place to start this discussion is on the conservation patio immediately after the session, because we will have a reception and books available too, right? So you can think through potential avenues of collaboration. I want to also thank Tiffany Clark and Candace Vinson. They are program managers here with the Research Initiatives team. None of this would be possible without them, and we really appreciate all of the hard work that you put into making this happen, which included working with Dr. Nofil. So without further ado, I am now going to turn it over to Dr. Nofil, who is an assistant professor of history here at William & Mary. She holds a PhD in history from Columbia University and BAs in history and public policy from Duke University. Her broad remit of work focuses on immigration, public health, borderlands, and US political and legal history. Dr. Nofil, thank you for being here. Congratulations, and over to you.
Okay, all right, I have a wireless mic, so I hope it sounds fine. Okay, awesome. Thank you guys so much for coming. This is like so special on the date of the book's birth to be here with you all. I'm especially so happy to see some students that just, oh, okay, and it's over. The book had a good run, and well, thank you. I honestly cannot believe GRI agreed to this still. I feel like I came to you with a really half-baked idea, but this is just, it's fantastic. And thank you so much to Ryan and to Candace and to Tiffany for organizing this, and also to the history department and the libraries for co-sponsoring. So I am going to try not to talk too long. I would love to take questions and sort of talk about detention and deportation with all of you. All right, so here's my book. So I am going to start today at the American border that people care about a lot less, which is the border the United States shares with Canada. However, it has been getting a little bit of attention recently. A few months ago, the New York Times published this big investigation, sort of discussing how apprehensions are absolutely skyrocketing on the northern border. It is mostly migrants from Latin America, Asia, particularly India, who are entering through Canada and then typically just crossing the border on foot into these rural dairy farming communities in northern New York. It is obviously a much less policed border, but it is a tremendously dangerous journey all the same. So about 100 years ago, this exact same route through northern New York was a site and a source of sort of national anxiety about how weak the nation's borders were. So one journalist who was working in the northern New York region in 1925, he said something very peculiar is happening here along the Canadian border. He said, I visited the jails, these tiny little county jails and these rural counties, and the people in these jails are not local people who are accused of breaking local laws. He says they are immigrants from all over the world who are awaiting immigration hearings and deportations. So he says the federal government has turned our tiny little jails into boarding houses. They are paying these communities a nightly rate for each person they detain in these jails. And he described it like this. He said, here almost daily, federal officers call for aliens. They are handcuffed. They are led through the main streets of this village to be photographed, yet the spotlight that plays around Ellis Island is not trained upon small county jails. So I think this is such an evocative line, right? Because it is sort of a rumination about what it means to be on the peripheries of border enforcement, to be doing the same work they're doing at Ellis Island, but with a fraction of the attention and perhaps a fraction of the resources. But I also really like this line as sort of a challenge to scholars of migration and of incarceration. So how does the story of migrant incarceration change if we look to these small jails on the peripheries? If we look at spaces that are not explicitly marked as sites of migrant detention, and if we look at spaces where the federal government is paying localities a nightly rate for each migrant they detain as a federal prisoner. This is money that at the beginning of the 20th century is frequently just going to be pocketed by the county sheriff. But by the end of the 20th century is going to be reinvested into building bigger jails, bigger prisons, and giving more resources to local law enforcement. So what this journalist observed and encountered in 1925 on the edge of the nation continues to play out in the United States nearly a century later. Migration control is a project that relies on local carceral space, local police power, and local community support. It traverses, I think, foreign affairs and local politics in a way that few other issues do. And it is a project that continues to make a lot of people a pretty staggering amount of money. I think what is so sort of significant about this practice is that over a century, migrant detention shows local leaders that their jail, something they probably thought of as sort of a liability, something that was very expensive to run, right? No one is ever particularly enthusiastic about funding their little local jail. It showed them that this could not just be something that cost money, but it could be like a product and a service that localities sold to the federal government and sold to others. So the jail could be something that produced revenue. And that I think turns out to be a very dangerous idea. So I'll return to this chart, but I want to just chat a little bit about what immigration detention looks like, today. So if you remember one thing about immigration detention, probably the most important thing to know about it is that it is a civil or administrative process. So it is not criminal. So what that means in practice is that folks who are moving through the immigration detention system have no right to an attorney, they have no right to a trial. by jury, and they are just distanced from the due process protections that we would expect from a criminal trial in basically every way. So detention today occurs at different points in people's migration journeys. For some people, it is right after they cross a border. That could be a land border. That could also be, sort of at an airport. But increasingly, people are being apprehended through what ICE calls interior apprehension efforts. And this can look different ways. So kind of the most visible manifestation of it is raids on workplaces and homes. But increasingly, the number one way that people will end up in ICE detention today is because they have some sort of other interaction with law enforcement. Okay, so this could be something as basic as a traffic stop. But there is tremendous data sharing between your local police department and ICE. Today, they share databases, they share biometric information, and so it has become tremendously easy in many communities for local law enforcement to just hand someone off to ICE and typically into detention. So migrants are being held in a variety of facilities today. Some are going to be operated by private prison companies, some are operated by the federal government. But what I am particularly interested in this project is the enormous number of migrants that are just being held in sort of your regular city and county jail. So, there's kind of a boom in mass incarceration scholarship right now. Jails are very much in the shadow of federal and state prisons. They are sort of, I think, overlooked in a lot of ways. A lot of people don't stay there particularly long, but jails are absolutely fascinating and important institutions in their own right. So compared to a federal or state prison, a jail is locally operated. It's typically overseen by a sheriff who's typically elected. I think this makes them sort of unique, right? Because they are so deeply influenced by local politics, by local budgets, by sort of the agenda of your, city district council. And they're also really heterogeneous spaces. They hold a really wide variety of people. So that includes people who are pre-trial, right, who may or may not be released with the payment of bail. It includes people who have relatively short sentences and convictions, typically of under a year. And it also includes people who are being held for a federal agency such as ICE. Okay. All right. So, as Ryan said, my book is really an examination, right, of how the federal government over a century convinces localities that it is a good idea to be in the migrant detention and deportation business. Something that for most of the 20th century, cities and localities would have assumed they had no responsibility to do. How do you convince them that this is actually their problem, that they should want to help the immigration service? So even as the federal government builds migrant detention facilities of its own, and even as it finds these private prison companies to work with, county jails continue to serve an essential role. And part of why they're so important is because they exist in virtually every American community. So it basically gives the Immigration Service a footprint anywhere they want in the United States. So any perceived crisis, whether it is a scandal about how horrible conditions are, whether it's a natural disaster, whether it is an uprising or hunger strike among migrants, can be remedied by moving migrants to these decentralized and nearly invisible outposts. So it creates a system of detention that is virtually impossible to sort of gain a comprehensive view of. And it shows that mass deportations were and continue to be extraordinarily difficult without the aid of local governments. So I think this is really big stakes for a lot of the immigration policy issues we're thinking through today. Certainly, right, the promise of mass deportations is hanging over this presidential election, but also many of these issues that people have reckoned with in the past couple of years, right? These questions about whether Governor DeSantis can bus migrants to Martha's Vineyard, or these questions about whether Governor Abbott can string barbed wire across the Rio Grande. Or these questions about whether cities can say we're actually not working with ICE at all, and whether cities can be punished for that. These are all fundamentally questions about how states and localities participate in federal immigration law enforcement, what obligations they have, what rights they have, and the sort of very messy jurisdictional jurisdictional arguments therein. All right, so for the rest of the time today, I'm gonna just talk about a few stories from this book, and I hope it'll give you a sense of how detention has absolutely dramatically expanded across the past century, but also many of its continuities, namely the way that it has always been a space of tremendous, tremendous violence against groups the US deemed too poor, too radical, and above all, too racially different. So the book starts with Chinese exclusion. It starts in these exact same northern New York counties that the New York Times was writing about earlier this year. The archival record for jails is bad. Jails do not preserve their records. So this book is kind of a miracle. This is a jail ledger from Essex County. It was preserved by just a historical society upstate, and it's a totally remarkable record. So one of the things that we know about jails in northern New York is that at the turn of the 20th century, they were detaining thousands of Chinese migrants who were entering through Canada in an attempt to evade the Chinese Exclusion Act. Okay? So this jail book is sort of a testament to that. And sort of in looking through it, there's about 700 entries. This one goes from 1901 to 1904. And a few things stood out to me. So you can see it sort of logs the day someone enters the jail, the day someone exits the jail, and it also notes what happens to them, if they're deported, if they're admitted into the United States, and so forth. So I think the first thing that's really striking here is how long the average detention is. So people who work on Angel Island and Ellis Island, they say sort of the average detention for a Chinese migrant was about 2 weeks, sometimes inching towards 3 weeks. The average detention in northern New York was about 5 months. So people are spending an enormous amount of time in these really, really just ill-suited rural jails. The second thing that I think would stand out to anyone looking at this is how unsuccessful the US is at deporting the people it jails. So virtually everyone on this page, but the vast majority of people logged in this book in general, are not going to be deported. They are going to be released into the community. The way this is happening is that virtually everyone in this jail, it is men, exclusively men, as well as children. That's a child on the bottom right. They're filing habeas corpus claims. They are going to claim that they are US citizens being illegally detained. And at least for the early years of the 20th century, these claims are going to be remarkably effective. So they're going to end up in jail for a long time, but the vast majority of them will eventually be released. Okay, so even if there's a light at the end of the tunnel, the actual conditions of incarceration are absolutely horrific. They are miserable, they are dangerous. So inspectors who visit these jails, they regularly note that 100 migrants are being held in spaces designed to hold a maximum of 12 people. You can imagine what that felt like. And they also note that these places are massive public health liabilities, particularly when epidemic disease breaks out. So it's hard to know how many people died in these facilities, but it was not insignificant. The records have notes about the Immigration Service purchasing caskets, finding sort of fields to bury bodies in. So all of the people on this slide died in Franklin County in Malone, New York, the youngest of whom is 17. So in the wake of these deaths, one of the interesting things we see is a real reckoning in many of these communities about what we're doing here, right? About what is migrant incarceration? Is this a good business for our town to be in? Is it Christian? Can we justify it? So you see here, this is from the Malone Farmer, which is like not a radical publication. It has a circulation of like 500 farmers. And you see here, it's like, the Chinese exclusion law is a shame upon civilized government. And they say there's got to be something better than locking Chinese migrants in for months in jails or detention houses for no other cause than seeking to enter this prosperous country. And so I find this really fascinating, right? Because we start to see that people are watching what happens in migrant incarceration as early as 1904, and they're raising these big sort of existential questions, right? About what does it mean to be criminal? Is crossing a border without permission a criminal act? And also just sort of fundamentally, like, who does and does not deserve incarceration? And I think these are questions that recur again and again across the history of migrant detention. Okay, so it's a really tragic story, but it's also a story about rural political economy. So many people who are watching what happens in northern New York say, you know, the sheriffs actually really, really want to work with the immigration service. They want to be sent as many Chinese migrants as possible because they are making absolute bank off this, right? They are making their annual salary in 2 weeks of detaining this number of migrants. So we start to see counties competing against each other, lodging claims against one another for why the Immigration Service should send them and not their neighboring county more migrants. The other really fascinating thing that happens is once these jails get, you know, so overcrowded, they start to build these separate, segregated sites of migrant detention. All 4 of these counties will end up doing this. And it is very much a bargaining chip. It's very much a way for them to say, look, we built this. This is just a barn. They put bars on the windows, but they're like, look, we built this beautiful detention center. Please send us more people. So these towns absolutely do not want Chinese residents. They do not want Chinese people to live there. But this Chinese prisoner fills this really specific social and economic role. The economic role is totally intertwined with ideas about race. So if you read these documents, right, you will see so many comments like this that are sort of like praising the cleanliness, the industry, the docility of the Chinese migrants. There's one particular document that says overcrowding is only a concern to the white inmate, right? These comments that are like, they don't even notice. And these are so insidious, right? Because they sort of justify the horrific conditions, but they also really erase the way that Chinese migrants are using this time in detention and using the legal system as a mode of resistance against immigration law. So while people are incarcerated, right, they are connecting with attorneys, they are filing these habeas corpus claims, and many of them know that if they wait this out, right, if they can survive this detention, they will eventually get into the country. Okay, so a lot is going to change in the next 20 years. The Supreme Court is going to make it way, way harder to get these habeas petitions through. They're going to say, you know, that's clearly a problem. But also the demographics of who is looking for a backdoor into the nation are going to change too. So in the early 20th century, the US is going to move beyond just anti-Chinese immigration law. They're going to start passing anti-trafficking provisions, literacy tests, and sort of most notoriously, the quota law, which is going to restrict migration from Europe really in large numbers for the first time. So now as this image shows, right, it's like you've got French Canadians, you've got a guy from Chile, you've got all sorts of Europeans who are taking this same route into the nation that Chinese migrants pioneered. But something kind of interesting happens, which is that when the Immigration Service calls many of their old pals in northern New York and says, do you want to hold these people that we want to deport? Many sheriffs say, you know, this seemed like a good deal when it was all Chinese migrants, but now that it's this group of people, now in particular that it is white women and children you're asking us to detain, the embassies are calling us, the media is calling us, this doesn't seem like such a good deal to us anymore. So the US government is going to be in a bit of a pickle here, right? They have built this system that relies so heavily on jails, but it seems like, right, that these sheriffs and counties may not want to play ball. So throughout the mid-century, the US is going to experiment with different models of detention that move beyond jails alone, that sort of complement the system of jail detention. I'll talk just a little bit about 2 of them. One of the things they do is they start buying up entire floors of downtown office buildings. So this is in downtown San Francisco. It is just, you know, it is in the financial district. It is absolutely in the center of town. The Immigration Service is going to buy several floors. They're going to detain hundreds of primarily Chinese women who are married to American servicemen who are immigrating after the war. Um, Basically, no one is going to realize this is a detention site at all until this series of episodes where women manage to make it onto the roof of this building and threaten to jump. And all the depictions of this just describe like hundreds of office workers, right, watching this scene unfold, and sort of realizing for the first time, right, that this is also a site of incarceration. ICE still owns this space today. They still continue to operate out of this building. As the government becomes, deeply committed to the mass deportation of Mexican laborers post-war, they're also going to start experimenting with some new models. Notably, they're going to build these federal detention camps along the border. They're still using jails, as you can see, but these detention camps are new. One of the things that I find really interesting about the detention camps is that they're so controversial in a lot of these cities because cities say, we expanded our jails specifically because the Immigration Service told us they were going to keep sending us prisoners. And so now we've expanded our jails, and what are we supposed to do? So here's a line, which I think was incredibly prescient. Now apparently Texas towns are stuck with big jails and nobody to put in them but each other. The Immigration Service and the Border Patrol prefer a concentration camp of their own. So really evocative use of concentration camp post-war, but also just a really prescient question of what happens when you finance and build giant jails and then the Immigration Service's demand for the space recedes, right? Who are you going to put in them? Okay, so this is a chart I showed you at the beginning. So you can see detention absolutely exists. It is, I think notable that it exists earlier, but of course it absolutely skyrockets in the 80s and 90s. It is going to skyrocket at this point, largely because of the decisions of Ronald Reagan, who is going to become highly fixated on thwarting and deterring refugees and asylum seekers from the Caribbean, primarily from Cuba and Haiti. So Reagan and his administration, including a young Rudy Giuliani, are really going to crystallize a very specific ideology around detention, which is that if you can make asylum seeking as miserable as possible, right, that perhaps that will deter people from coming in the first place. Okay, so I want to just talk a little bit about one last case I find really interesting, which is what happens to a specific group of Cuban refugees who come in 1980. So in 1980, Fidel Castro opens the port of Mariel. He says, if you want to leave, you can leave. There's a bunch of, complicated diplomatic things leading up to that. But 125,000 Cuban refugees are going to come to South Florida in a couple of weeks. It is a really tremendous episode of migration. Jimmy Carter kind of flounders here. He makes up this basically completely fake legal status called Cuban Haitian entrant, which is sort of like refugee with the big caveat that if you have pretty much any interaction with the criminal justice system, any conviction, that status is revoked. So basically what happens is we end up with a group of people whose entrant status is revoked because they interact with the criminal justice system in some way. However, Fidel Castro says, I refuse to accept any of these people back. So now you have a population of people who have served a criminal sentence, but are now in administrative immigration detention indefinitely, who there is basically nothing on the horizon suggests that they can be deported. So obviously people are deeply frustrated with this. There are massive uprisings at detention centers and prisons holding this group of indefinitely detained Cubans. You can see here on the right. And so the Immigration Service returns to kind of its favorite strategy. They say, we'll take the people out of these centralized facilities and we will just scatter them around jails throughout the country where we think it will be harder for them to organize, to stage uprisings. So one of the communities that these folks are sent to is Avoyelles Parish. It's in central Louisiana. It's overseen by this guy, the helmet haircut on the left. His name is Bill Belt. He's sheriff for 25 years, which is like a normal sheriff trajectory. It's the weirdest job in America. So they called Bill Belt up and they say, can we send you some of these indefinitely detained Cubans? And he says, absolutely. We're in like absolutely horrific economic straits. So Bilbao starts detaining Cubans in the early 1980s. By 1990, he has built 5 jails in this parish, 4 new jails. He turns a desegregated school into a women's jail for Cuban women. He manages to quintuple the sheriff's budget. And by the end of the 90s, he's holding more of these Cubans than any other community in the country. And sheriffs throughout the nation are going to look at what Sheriff Bell is doing, and they're going to say, wow, right? That seems very economically promising. We would like in on that. So this is, all the way in Illinois. This warden says, we've been working with the Immigration Service for decades to detain Mexicans. We usually held Mexicans about 15 days in the county jail, but now it's just forever. Okay, so this idea that people who cannot be deported have a particular economic value. So most of the other Caribbean asylum seekers will be scattered throughout jails in Florida. This jail in Jackson County is interesting just because it has a particularly rich archival record. You can see here this quote. There's tons of petitions and letters from migrants in these jails, really trying to parse out this tension, right, of what it means to be a federal detainee who is under the control of a local sheriff, of a local warden, of these local workers. The other thing is this, this is an affidavit, a drawing attached to an affidavit from an Afro-Cuban refugee. And what he's protesting here is the use of electrified shields, which are electrified weapons, which he says are being used against protesting migrants at the Jackson County jail. So the Department of Justice will eventually look into this. They will confirm this story. They will say these electrified shields were not only being used, they were being used to threaten pregnant women. And it's just horrific, but it also, I think, is notable because by the 80s and 90s, the Immigration Service is in theory reforming its facilities, right? They are passing rules and laws and standards for their detention facilities. But for people who are held in jails, not held in immigration detention facilities, these rules and standards have no application. They do not apply. So electric weapons were banned in immigration facilities, but they are not banned in Florida jails. So people in jails are vulnerable to different and specific types of violence. Okay, so I can talk more about this in the Q&A, but real quick, I think it is notable. This is how ICE acquires space today. So you've probably heard that private prison companies are a big deal for immigration detention, and they are. However, ICE only directly contracts with private prison companies in 8% of its cases. So this big section of the chart, this 87%, is something called intergovernmental agreements, and that is ICE contracting with localities. Okay, so basically what happens is ICE signs a contract with Williamsburg, for example, and then Williamsburg could either hold people in its local jail, or it could sign its own contract with a private prison company. And most are going to sign their own contracts with private prison companies. So essentially what ICE is doing is it is turning localities into a middleman. The reasons for this are there's many, but the biggest one is just that there are much less stringent contracting rules on localities. It is remarkable how much easier it is for localities to contract with private prison companies than the federal government. But obviously all of this makes it just outrageously hard to figure out what is going on. Okay, so to wrap up, I think this book's big takeaways are that local politics matter a lot in immigration law enforcement. And I think it's something that activists like Abolish ICE have been particularly well attuned to in recent years, right? That challenging immigration law doesn't just mean something that happens on the federal level, but it means the decisions that your sheriff and your city council and your local elected officials are making also. I think the Immigration Service historically and today just has insulated itself from accountability in stunning ways through this nesting doll of contracts and subcontracts and arbitrary frequent transfers of people through this vastly diffused detention system. It is a system that is very hard to legally challenge or even to see. And it is a system that has expanded incarceration for citizens and non-citizens alike, fueled by racism, nativism, and the potential for financial profit. That's it.
All right. In order for Brianna to be able to write down some responses to the questions that you pose, I've agreed to come up here and moderate. So I'll take 2 questions at a time, and then I'll turn it over to Brianna to provide responses. When you ask your question or give a comment, please also introduce yourself. Tiffany has a microphone and she'll be walking around with it for you to ask. So, gentleman in the back, if you could introduce yourself and ask your question. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Atticus. Thank you so much for this presentation. This was just wonderful. I'm looking forward to reading your book. I have 2 kind of small related questions. So, one, are these localities required and obligated to work with ICE if they reach out to them and say, we'd like to contract you? Is that an obligation for them? And then how much variation exists in between different localities and different jails? That is it worse in Florida than it may be in Arizona? Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Gavin in the back. We'll do one more and then you can test the microphone.
Hey, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. So my question, I'm Gavin, by the way, I work here at GRI. And my question is, you allude a lot to the ability of local jails to divide migrants from their communities as a kind of tactical step. What do you notice as differences between like culture in a local jail versus in one of these mass detention camps or federal or state prison?
Thank you. Thank you for those questions. So are localities required to cooperate when ICE says they want to hold people in the local jail? That is a heated legal debate right now. For a long time, the understanding was no, that was a violation of the 10th Amendment, that you could not coerce subfederal government into enforcing federal laws. But many people are trying to change that right now. So in theory, no. In practice, right, I think there's all sorts of reasons that places might feel pressure, right? And so in a lot of cases, it's not like the federal government is explicitly saying we're going to punish you. But this is something I think you see even like in the 1920s when these places are trying to say like, maybe we're not so enthusiastic about detaining Europeans. A lot of these localities say, I don't know, there might be other kinds of punishments that we can't anticipate. Do we really want to get the federal government on our bad side? Maybe it's easier to just go along with it. So I think there's sort of like soft power things happening here as well. But a lot of these like legal fights about like sanctuary status right now, right? They're fundamentally reckoning with this question of like, do you have to cooperate? And also, what does cooperation mean, right? Like, what are the boundaries of that? Like, so yeah, so it's up for debate. How different are jails in different places? I think they're so different. I think that is like part of what is so fascinating about jails as institutions is that they look nothing like each other, right? Jails can be these like massive, skyscraper facilities that hold thousands and thousands of people. They can also just be like basically still today a barn that we put some bars on the windows. And both of them are bad in their own way. And it's interesting, like it's not uncommon over the course of like one deportation proceeding for migrants to have been through like 6 or 7 jails across multiple states, which is also just a totally bizarre perspective that most people who interact with a jail would never get. So one of the things I find really interesting too is reading like their own recounting of what makes a jail or a detention center better or worse than another. But yeah, I think they're broadly bad, but the conditions are disparate. The question about what does it mean? How do jails sort of specifically separate people from community? I think there's a few ways, and I think like what I want to avoid saying is that like holding people in federal immigration detention centers is a better solution, right? Like this jail model is bad. This is really not good. But federal immigration detention centers are also a disaster. They are just a different type of disaster. So I definitely don't think there's like, you don't want to romanticize one version of incarceration. What I think is particularly bad about jails, is that they tend to be even further from where people are apprehended. Not always, but frequently. I also think part of the challenge is just that, for immigration detention centers tend to have some amount of legal aid. If immigration attorneys are going to go anywhere, right, they're probably going to go to the place where they know that most migrants in need of legal aid are held. That really gets hard. That really gets hard if people are just in the local jail. Also, ICE's data on this, what they actually have to report about where people are, is basically nothing. ICE to this day claims they do not have a list of every jail they contract with. They would tell you, right? They would tell you, oh, it's ad hoc, right? Like sometimes we just have to call up the sheriff and see what he can do for us, blah, blah, blah. But it is remarkably hard to find people. The other thing that I think just like makes me want to burn this thing through is that they don't have to tell you when you're being transferred. So they do not have to, if you are lucky enough to have legal representation, they do not have to tell your lawyer, they do not have to tell your family. ICE has basically total control over transfers. And that is why ICE having access to thousands of American jails is like particularly devastating.
Yeah, like Tierney, I'm in the government. In the government department. And this is fascinating. I know nothing about this, so thank you so much for sharing your work. Two questions. One is in the weeds, whether historically or in the contemporary setting, I'm interested in whether counties or sheriffs get paid for anything other than housing immigrants.
Yeah.
So do you get paid to arrest, to investigate, to share information, to enter data? All these other things that county administrations and sheriffs do, are there contracts for those things? And so that's in the weeds. The broader question is one that you hinted at. You hinted at the relevance of history and specifically your historical research for contemporary policy debates and contemporary political debates. But I wonder if you could speak a bit more generally about applied history. You have a finite number of hours in a day to spend. Do you, as a historian, want to be doing work that speaks to contemporary policymakers and politicians? Is that how you want to spend your time? And second, does your discipline that kind of work? Are you allowed, are you incentivized to do that or disincentivized to do that?
One more question, yeah. Back there.
Hi, Brianna. It's Hiroshi Kitamura in history. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I guess my question, it seems, I totally get this idea that decentralization is a problem, but also it seems like the lack of transparency is another big problem. So I'm just wondering, for example, for ICE, what's the basis of their protection from, not having to disclose information to the public? And I'm just wondering if you could comment on this issue of the lack of transparency versus, perhaps maybe if there's a solution to the immigration problem, transparency could be one of them.
Yes. So I'll answer Hiroshi's question first. So historically, a lot of the ways that the Immigration Service has gotten around disclosures, I think frankly, part of it is just like incompetence. Like so much of it is just saying like, we never reported that. We didn't know anyone would ever ask. They purged a lot of records, but I think that another sort of justification has been that migration is part of foreign affairs and national security. So it is the plenary power doctrine, right? It is this notion that this is a arena where the courts have a very limited role, where if it pertains, if we treat migrants as the courts very explicitly do, right, in the Chinese exclusion era, if we treat migrants as foreign aggressors, then that basically makes migration, it's a power of security, it's a power of war. Right. So that has been a justification throughout the Immigration Service's trajectory for their just staggeringly bad record keeping. And I think it is, one of the things that you see by the late 20th century when Congress does start to get interested in these sites they go to investigate some of these detention sites, and they say, they find that like the Immigration Service is actively lying to them. Like they visit this site in Miami, and they find that like hundreds of migrants are being hidden in closets for this congressional visit, right? And there's this big discourse about like, how did we end up with this federal bureaucracy that is so out of control, right? That seems to follow its own rules, that seems so insulated from oversight. And I think a lot of it has to do with the sort of distinct positioning of it as this sort of pseudo branch of foreign affairs. Counties and sheriffs, and how are they making money? So yeah, they're not financially incentivized for data sharing. I think increasingly, at least under the first Trump presidency, there was a threat that they would be penalized, right? So that they would take away federal money that they were receiving elsewhere if they didn't data share. So there is sort of, threat of punishment. A lot of that was held up in court, but, could certainly come up again. One thing that is interesting with our Bill Belt, a lot of people in Avoyelles, they keep saying like, why is he doing this? Why is he building so many jails? Like, what is he getting out of this? And they later find out he's investigated by the FBI because he is pocketing all of the money from phone calls at the jail. And this is a huge issue. The rates for people incarcerated in all sorts of facilities to make phone calls are staggering. And they are typically run by some sort of local private company, right? So there's tremendous money to be made. So a sheriff like this, right, even if he is not, even if the money from incarceration is going back into the county budget at this point, there are still like sneaky ways for him to kind of carve off other money-making opportunities from this sort of mass incarceration. What am I doing with my life? Was this I don't know. Yeah, we'll see. I think applied history is good. I don't feel strongly disincentivized from doing it. And I think this is important. And I also am realistic about getting anyone to read this academic monograph. So I think it will probably involve like writing some shorter things that are not this book. But I do think it's relevant and important. So.
Other questions? We'll do 3 this round at the end of the time, right here in the purple lecture.
Hi, I'm Crystal. I was one of Dr. Nofil's students last semester. The question I had was, in speaking to relevance, the recent overturning of the Chevron defense. And you might not know the answer to this question, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how that might impact the immigration process, especially ICE and their working with local courts now that it is not like the legal ruling that local courts have to defer to federal agencies.
Mm-hmm.
Their hands. I saw a bunch. Let's go right here in the front.
There you go, coming.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Sarah Hart. I'm a professor in theater and performance. I have spent time visiting migrants detained in jails in California, and as part of my dissertation, PhD dissertation. And so I'm very aware of how this strategy of separation and isolation is very effective. There are these programs, that exist just to visit people who are detained. And I have 2 questions. So one is, what happened, or how did this jail strategy interact with the families that were separated when children were being put in cages and then getting lost by the system, and the families were not able to be reunited? I'm curious what happened and how the jails were involved. And then my other question is in relationship to this idea of kind of amnesia. So things like this are in the news and then we sort of forget about them. And it sounds like this strategy of isolation and separation helps with that. And so I'm interested, in how migrants themselves have potentially found tactics of resistance and of expression that have worked somehow to sort of overcome this public amnesia about this historical process.
Let's do one more question right there.
Hello, I'm Kit. Bit more of a historical question. I was curious, what made the early habeas corpus petitions so effective before the Supreme Court overturned them. Thank you.
Yeah. Should I go?
Turn it over to you.
Perfect. I'll start with the habeas corpus. It is so wild that this worked. That is, every time I read this, I say, how did this strategy possibly work? But it did. And so these, these habeas petitions were remarkably effective. It was a very short window where they were very effective. It was like roughly 1898 to like 1905. The path to the court is significantly cut off. And basically it is because the courts, I think very surprisingly, they do not have a lot of sympathy for Chinese litigants, right? They do not look highly on the Chinese litigants, but they do sort of repeatedly say, we think these people are entitled to some kind of due process, particularly because they are making these claims of citizenship. And those claims of citizenship are really key. They said, if they're not making these claims of citizenship, then whatever. And the Immigration Service is saying, well, but they're very weak claims of citizenship, right? We're pretty sure they're fraudulent. And like in the vast majority of cases, they're totally fraudulent, right? But they keep saying, well, if we treated these claims of citizenship as fake, we would have to treat like they specifically say like any white person who's returning from overseas and claims to be a citizen, then they could be subjected to this too. So there is a real sort of deference to due process and to habeas rights, at least for this narrow window of time. And so what's going to happen is that the Immigration Service is basically going to bring a bunch of legal cases saying, all of these are actually administrative procedures, I guess, kind of speaking to Chevron. They say, migrants should not be allowed to access the courts unless they are asking an original legal question. They can only, like, if they're just asking a question about entry or deportation, then those are all administrative decisions. So that means that an immigration judge today, or back then it was just like a guy, like just a bureaucrat, just the bureaucrat who was like living in upstate New York, he got to decide the legal question of if you were a citizen. So that's devastating, right? Like that completely curtails what had been for this brief window of time, a really, really effective legal strategy. I would love to hear more about your experiences. So interestingly, with family separation, jails were rarely sort of a first site of use. So the vast majority of sites that were being used were these sort of set up family detention sites, often run by private companies. What I do think is sort of relevant to this story is that even these so-called family detention sites are almost all set up through intergovernmental service agreements. So even like Eloy was a big one. That is being run through, so that one, is that in Arizona? I think it's in Arizona, but it is being run through an intergovernmental service agreement with a town in Texas. So in some cases, the middleman, the town that is working as a middleman, is not even in the state where the detention center is being run. And that was something that actually came up a lot. And part of the reason was that they needed these family detention sites very quickly. And so they took places that they already had existing intergovernmental agreements with, and they just edited the language. There's currently like a big investigation into whether this was legal and could happen again. But I think it also just speaks to like, no one cares about intergovernmental service agreements, right? They're just like, they're not glamorous and no one knows they exist. And so it gives ICE this really weird, flexible power in a lot of ways. Tactics of resistance. That's a wonderful question. There's so many. I think that what I hope for this book is that it is sort of like, it's a really heavy story, but I think there are so many moments of how people within institutions like organize to like sort of, just attempt to show humanity to the outside. I think that, in some cases it is like, I think in most cases it is these like massive protests and uprisings. I think in other cases it is working with media, working with lawyers. In many cases, people attempt to work with embassies. And with the case of the Haitians in the 80s, there is sort of a broad coalition building among like Black South Floridians writ large. The NAACP gets involved. And those tend to be really powerful. I think really powerful moments. So yeah, I feel like there's good stories of resistance in this as well. The Chevron case, I do not know. Great question. Let me think about it.
We have time for one more question, maybe two more questions. We'll go up front here. Great, if you could do that.
I'm Hannah Rosen in History and American Studies. Thank you, Brianna, for the presentation and for taking on the project. It's really very important, and thank you. So I was thinking when you were talking about how dispersed this system becomes and the effect of that on the people being detained, being sent to small towns all over the country, and as a result, access to lawyers, et cetera. And then you mentioned that this is a way that people lose track of their, or an ability to get in touch with the person who they're already building a case with, et cetera. And then your response to Sarah's question about resistance made me start thinking, well, originally I was thinking, like, how are decisions made about who goes where, and how is this like spider's web keep growing out? And now I'm wondering, is there anything actively being done by either local or federal authorities to intentionally undermine these strategies of resistance and separate people from their lawyers and make it more complicated? And if someone's transferred 6 times, I mean, what could possibly be the explanation for that? Unless one's facility is closing and everyone goes. But if it's individual transfers, is there any evidence in the present or the past of a strategy, on the government's part to undermine people's efforts to challenge the system?
Well, let's do one more question, Mike.
Thank you very much, and thanks for this excellent presentation. As I'm Michael Butler from the History Department. For 30 years in a previous career, I dealt with things like this, and I learned an enormous amount from your presentation. So insofar, if I can make a brief comment, insofar as the question of applied history, this is a great example of what it can do. So thank you very much for that. My question is, you spoke of the Canadian border when you were speaking about the early 20th century, and then you switched down to talk about Mariel and that particular issue. What was it like along the Mexican border during the beginning of the 20th century? Was it similar to what was happening in Canada, or was there more fluid movement where people were just willing to say, yeah, we accept the movement of people without putting them in jail?
Yeah, so kind of what happens immediately after, there's a bunch of court decisions that make it harder to access the courts, and that sort of shut down that northern New York route as a popular route. It is really popular for like 5 years at best. But what happens after that is almost all of the Chinese migrants who want to enter the United States are going to shift to moving through Mexico. So kind of Canada's over, we're all going through Mexico now. There's a lot of advantages to it. There's really interesting examples, for example, of like racial passing, how people attempt to disguise themselves as indigenous or as Mexican to move through the borderlands. But a lot of the same tools are going to be used. So the Immigration Service is basically going to do exactly the same thing. They're going to start contacting sheriffs in the Southwest, and they are going to say exactly what happened in Northern New York. Like, can you hold people? I never see, I think Northern New York is still notable to me in that it is the place where I see this sort of economic competition the most. I don't see that same sort of towns competing against each other in the Southwest. I don't know why, but it looks very similar. And the U.S. immigration enforcement's sort of energy is very quickly going to shift away from this route to this other route. And I think also, right, it's just the fluidity of migration routes, right? Like one thing stops working, they are very quickly going to find a different path. Hannah, your question about why can this happen? Are there strategies? So there's been a bunch of like big legal victories for migrants over the years, but they all have like a big caveat. So for example, in the 80s, the Haitian Refugee Center brings this massive class action lawsuit against the Reagan administration. They say basically this detention policy is being unequally applied, like it is only being applied to Black asylum seekers. No other asylum seekers are being treated this way. And then they also say this is a violation of administrative procedure. So they say, Reagan did not announce this policy. He basically just told immigration officials and it's quite explicit. He says like start processing Haitian cases as quickly as possible. And he says it's going to be like a mandatory detention policy for all Haitian asylum seekers. So they bring this to court. there are thousands of patients detained throughout Florida at this point, and they win the case. Like the judge like gives this absolutely like blistering opinion about like what a sort of miscarriage of justice this is, and just like, you know, it's just like one of the most blistering reports you ever read. But the outcome, right, is just that like you have to make it administratively legal. So basically they say, right, this was illegal because Reagan didn't do it through the proper administrative channels. But if the Immigration Service, like, you know, announces that it's a rule and then fields comments on the rule, then you can do it. Then that is actually perfectly acceptable. So there are these moments, right? And like that's still kind of a moment because everyone is released from detention while it is pending. But, you know, it takes the Reagan administration like 2 weeks. They're super mad about it. They get the comments, they dismiss all the comments, and then they put it in writing. And then it, you know, sticks until today. So the courts, I think, do not want to be involved in a lot of this. Like, I think that is plenary power, is just this notion that immigration is this weird no man's land for the courts where they don't get involved unless they absolutely must. And when they do get involved, it tends to be these sort of mild administrative fixes that do very little to kind of fundamentally change the system.
All right. With
I'm right
that,
on time.
food, drinks, books, all on the conservation patio out here to the left. But before we go, let's congratulate Dr. Brianna Nofil. We're done. All right.
Okay,
Congrats.
thank you.
Come out here.